afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative. This is related to the supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation topics. This is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. And then we have Mark Richardson, who is the facilitator, and Bob Cott, who is the scribe for this working group. And then we have Phil Pettengill, who is the coordinator overseeing all 3 of the EDAM working groups. Just as a reminder, we only have 1 meeting scheduled this week for each of the working groups, the EDAM working groups. So the next week we will return to our regular cadence of Mondays and Wednesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. for this particular working group, and that will be the same for the rest of the EDAM working groups. We'll return to the 2 meetings per week cadence. So Mark is going to start off by providing an overview of the RSE evaluation framework, and then George Angelides from the ISO will present the optimized sufficiency portfolio approach, and then Mark will discuss the WSPP Schedule C arrangements, and then at the end, Bob Cott will provide a recap of the discussion, and then Mark will review the topics for the meeting next Monday. So if at any time you have a question, of course, feel free to raise your hand, or if you'd like to make a comment, the facilitator will call on you when it's your turn in the queue. And then just as a reminder to please state your name and affiliation first. We are recording the meeting, and we'll post the video file out on the Working Group 1 webpage as soon as we receive it from the vendor. That's where you'll find the other materials related to this working group. So today we have this presentation here on the screen, and then we also have the presentation from the ISO. And just as a reminder to please request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related meeting transcriptions. And if you are interested in presenting at an upcoming working group meeting, please send your request using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation, and we will reach out to you and coordinate the logistics. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to Mark.
All right. Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, team, and happy Monday. Hope everyone had a great, safe weekend. We are almost to the halfway point with these meetings, so I really want to just appreciate everyone's commitment and overall discussion and engagement. It's been great to this point, and I look forward to continuing tackling some of these items that we put forth in front of you today. So for today's objectives, as Christina mentioned, we are going to kind of continue some discussion around the relevant RSE scope topics. Really, for last week, we kind of heard various ideas around the RSE framework, so I have a slide here that I kind of plan on teeing up and walking through just to ensure everyone's on the same page. And then also in last week's discussion, there sounded like there was a need or some ideas getting kicked around a quote unquote optimization-based RSE approach. So I think the ISO team has come prepared today to show stakeholders what that looks like, and we'll go from there. And then lastly, before we concluded last week's call, I did tee up the WSPP Schedule C accounting rules, and I'm going to be looking to the audience to kind of help frame that up, provide the audience what those arrangements look like, and then kind of start talking about how those qualify and what exactly those details pertain. Next slide, please. All right, so with this slide, before going through the different evaluation frameworks, I wanted to highlight some of the common themes between the various evaluation framework approaches that we had discussed to this point. So all of the frameworks, we've agreed as a group, or at least have common consensus as a group, to evaluate the day-ahead sufficiency across the full 24-hour horizon. There's a need to test for both the capacity and flexibility, allow for on-demand RSE advisory runs by the EDAM entity, with the final scheduled advisory run being at 0900 with inputs locked at that time, so you're not trying to hit a moving target. I wanted to add there will be additional tests in either of these approaches to ensure that there are sufficient ancillary service and imbalanced reserve bids to meet the associated requirements for each EDAM entity. Next slide, please. All right, so last Monday, the meeting started with me highlighting 2 RSE framework approaches from the previous week's discussion. This led to stakeholder discussion and input on a hybrid approach, along with an optimization-based approach. Today, I wanted to level set where I believe we're at this point and then ask the ISO to provide their proposal as a response to stakeholder requests from what we will term as the optimized sufficiency portfolio approach. So approaches discussed to this point include the day-ahead sufficiency plan, which is a framework where each EDAM entity submits a day-ahead load and resource plan along with the associated bids. The second framework concept is a hybrid bid schedule approach that the ISO proposed and is primarily based on bids provided. This approach introduced a new advisory operating schedule bid component for energy-limited resources to utilize in providing their next day's planned operating schedule. This mainly stemmed from our hydro and battery discussions early on when we were talking about RSE accounting rules. Now, just to be clear, this hybrid bid schedule approach would use the advisory operating schedule for energy-limited resources and use the actual submitted bid range for all other resources. The advisory operating schedule bid component would not be utilized in the EDAM market optimization itself. The final approach here started to gain traction in our last call by participants, and I believe the ISO team is prepared to present on what exactly this optimized sufficiency portfolio may end up looking like. In review of this plan, I believe it considers and combines some of the concepts and concerns raised in the previous two framework ideas, and hopefully will get us closer to a framework that conceptually makes sense so we can move forward. Prior to turning over to the ISO team, let me pause here and see if there's any questions with what I just laid out. So with that, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, let me know I'm at least tracking with the conversation, or if there's any questions or thoughts you have prior to turning it over to George to talk about this optimized sufficiency portfolio. I see Michelle Keto in the queue. Good afternoon, Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from CPC. When you say each entity submits a day-ahead load and resource plan, do you mean here the BAA?
Right. It's at the EDAM entity itself.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your question, Michelle. Are there any other questions or comments prior to turning it over to George? All right. I don't see any other hands. Thank you, Michelle. All right. George, did you want to take it from here and provide details on how you envision this approach working?
Thank you, Mark. Let me share my presentation. And if you can confirm with me that you can see it on the screen.
I see it, George.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. And I want to go over a few slides that we prepared to illustrate how this approach for resource sufficiency evaluation using an optimization model could work out. Something that was taking traction in the last meeting that we had.
Hi, George. I hate to interrupt you. Oh, it looks like you closed out everything. You had a great walk. Perfect. Perfect. And then,
thank you.
Yes, and go into presentation mode, and you'll be all set. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So again, the objective is to have something simple so that it can be made as an on-demand application for any EDAM entity to check their passing ability for the resource efficiency test at any time. Before we formally execute the resource efficiency test, as we have said before, at 9 a.m. and one last time at 10 a.m. before we run the market. It is an optimization approach. However, it's not really at the level of complexity of a full market solution. So I still stick to what I used to say always since the beginning of these calls in this work group, that we don't want to run the market before we run the market. So the idea is that we are going to use the resource energy bids that they're submitted, and we're only going to use the energy bid range for this tool. We're not using the bid prices, so we're not doing any kind of economic optimization. We're using the energy bid ranges and the capability of the resources as it is registered in the master file to calculate for each EDAM BAA a feasible hourly resource schedule for the entire trading day that meets the demand forecast and uncertainty requirements. And these last and the latter, the uncertainty requirements could be adjusted by bucket one transfers, as we said before. And again, the requirement is the demand forecast as adjusted by bucket one energy transfers, plus minus the upward and downward uncertainty requirement, again, as adjusted by bucket one imbalance reserve transfers. So this is the input to the tool, okay, and the objective is to minimize hourly failures. So the tool will calculate an hourly schedule profile. Actually, we'll calculate two hourly schedule profiles. One, we call it the high schedule, trying to meet the upward requirement, and a lower schedule, trying to meet the downward requirement. And we have included constraints in this to make sure that the schedule that results from the tool is feasible. So we make sure that the schedule adheres to the energy bid limits, so we stay within the energy bid range, the ramp rate capability limits of each resource, the VER forecast for each VER, the daily energy limits for hydro resources, and the state of charge limits for storage resources. So we put all this in. Now, because again, we want to make sure that this is simple enough to be able to have it as an on-demand application, we have to scale down our expectations in terms of what constraints we can enforce. So there is a list of constraints that we want to ignore in this tool. And first and foremost, no transmission constraints or scheduling limits of any kind. So essentially, it's like all resources of an EDAM BAA are all at one single node. So there's no network in this tool. We also don't want to have a very complex system with binary variables modeling all the complex commitment intertemporal constraints for startup time, minimum downtime, or daily starts. So we ignore all that, and we propose to use a simple notion where in any hour that bids are submitted, we consider that the resource could be online. Otherwise, it is offline, and we don't consider it in the evaluation for that particular hour. Something simple that we can do, and we were always planning to do even with the previous proposal, we will make sure that we will adhere to the startup times from the initial condition if the initial condition has the resource to be offline. Even if there are bids at the beginning of the trading day, if the startup time is several hours, we will not consider these bids until the startup time elapses. So that is simple to do. It's static. It's not dynamic. It doesn't require binary variables. So this is something we can easily do. But having a full model for the commitment status of resources as they can be on, off with all these intertemporal constraints is out of the scope for this tool. And by extension, the same happens with MSG resources because that is actually even more complicated than your normal startup. It has transitions between states, and we want to keep it simple. So for MSG resources, the proposal here is to consider the entire capacity under bids as a single continuous operating range. So we'll merge all the configuration bids. We have one range that covers the entire set of bids for all configurations. We will not observe transition times. It will be like one continuous model, and this will avoid the use of the complicated MSG model that will really undermine the objective of the simple tool. We'll also not consider any ancillary service bids or imbalance reserve bids. We're not optimizing here with energy. We're not running a market. We just want to use the energy bid range. If there is any ancillary service bid capacity that overlaps with the energy bid range, we just ignore that. We will have a separate test, which is very simple, that will make sure that we have sufficient ancillary service and imbalance reserve bids to meet the ancillary service and imbalance reserve requirements. That will be separate from that, and it's very easy to do. So that covers the ancillary service and imbalance reserves. We just don't want to co-optimize with the effort here in this simple tool. And again, for ramp rates, today our market, of course, is very sophisticated. It supports dynamic ramp rates with variable ramp that can change at different operating points of a resource. In this tool, we will not be able to support that, so we'll use a weighted average flat ramp rate over the entire range of the energy bid that is submitted. And for MSGs, of course, as we said, we'll consider one continuous range, so we'll calculate some average ramp for the entire resource. Now, I want to stress that, again, this is a compromise that we're making between performance requirements and accuracy. We're trying to hit the middle line here where we can have sufficiently accurate results for the purpose of the test without turning this into a market, so that we can do it as an on-demand application.
George, before you move on, I'm sorry, we have a gentleman in the queue. And I think a few of the other, and if you don't mind maybe going back one slide, George, I think some of the other concerns that this alleviates was being able to account for some of these energy limited resources. It takes the ownership off of the SC or the EDAM entity providing what they believe the operating schedules would be for the following day, and really allows the ISO to consume all that bid information and kind of put it in a way across all 24 hours, both from a min and high bid range standpoint for accounting purposes. So I see Petter in the queue. So Petter, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, let everyone know who you're affiliated with, and then go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Hey, Mark, this is Petter from SGM. George, philosophy of CAISO markets from MRTU days was always to do as good as we can. And this proposal, in my opinion, is not as good as it should be, as it can be. So when you have concerns about performance and complexity, we have to start from requirements. How fast should this solve for end user who is running this test before CAISO runs the test themselves? And those tests will be run individually for each BA. And I said on the last call, if you can solve it in 5 minutes or less, that would be practically very useful. So when I see what you are proposing, I have a couple of concerns. First, about accuracy. If you don't have ancillary services allocate fixedly on units, you're not going to have accurate calculation of resource sufficiency. So you need to have, I'm not saying you should optimize ancillary services, but people should provide you where ancillary services are, on which units and how much to meet their NERC requirements. And you should be able, based on segments where it is and provided ramps, to figure out are they meeting 10 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever it is. So that accuracy needs to be there. That's one. The other one that I think is not as good as it should be is that you're using weighted average ramps. And especially for MSGs, that's a big inaccuracy because there is more and more MSGs. And I don't know why you're worried about performance or anything, because it doesn't require any additional data input or preparation. People are entering all of this anyway. You're just disabling some of the features of the full market. So I would suggest you look into that to do it really right and enable multi-segment ramps like you have it in the market.
So now, Petter, hold on one second, George. I want to make sure, and maybe Petter, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but for your AS comment, are you saying, help me understand, and also the audience, what you mean by considering AS. So if someone is...
Let me tell you what I mean is that,
please,
if they have a unit that they register to master file, which is 100 megawatts, and they provide bid 100 megawatts, and they use 10 megawatts of that unit for reserve, you have to subtract that.
Because okay, so you're saying
You're probably assuming that unit can give you energy for resource sufficiency and reserve at the same time. It cannot.
Okay, so in your hypothetical example, only 90 megawatts would be accredited toward.
Only 90 megawatts would be a bid, and 10 megawatts is taking off for reserves, and they should meet the reserve for every hour. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that we should optimize the reserves. I'm just saying people need to know day ahead on which units they're going to have spin, non-spin regulation, whatever, and provide those fixed numbers like they're providing in EIM. In EIM, they are telling you this capacity is a reserve for reserve. Should be the same in the ahead. Now, the big deal is MSG, and I'm not sure which way is the right way, George. I don't think this is going to be performance impact for you. But let me tell you something else. I don't know where you're going to end up with GAG, but this resource sufficiency test, if it is run properly, can give you very good base schedule-like reference point for GAG calculation. Like poor man, two-pass solution we couldn't make work. And if you don't have MSG transitions, you may not have good base reference point. So I'm kind of neutral on this one. I'm not concerned about performance. You have it. There is a lot of MSG units all over the place. It will be good if you can provide this. The rest is really good idea what you're simplifying.
Thank you, Petar. All right, George, go for it. Sorry. And I encourage others to raise their hand and also provide their perspectives. I think this is going to be a good conversation, and I would like to see if there's others that are in line with Petar's concerns, or if some of those concerns raised aren't necessarily a concern. So, George, let me go to you first, and then I'm gonna go to Robert.
Thank you. Thank you, Petar, for your comments, and I was actually expecting them. As you know, I always want to start from a simple point, so I want to present the Honda version of the automobile before we go into higher elements and test the waters and see how far we can go. I see this effort and this discussion as basically a trade-off. The more we pull into making this more sophisticated, the more we endanger that we won't be able to provide it as an on-demand application. So we have to be cognizant of that. I want to answer some of the questions some of the elements that you brought up regarding the ancillary services. Of course, for EDAM BAAs, as we said in day one, we will not be co-optimizing ancillary services. So participants that they submit their ancillary service schedules as a form of self-provision, because these are fixed, we can calculate it and take it from the top of the resource capacity. Any overlapping capacity with energy bid, we can cut it off. So we can take care of that. However, we can't do that for ISO resources because they have ancillary service bids, and we don't want to co-optimize here. And we cannot do it anyway for imbalanced reserve bids because imbalanced reserve is always co-optimized with energy even for EDAM BAA. So I think just doing this easy, if you will, adjustment for the ancillary services of the EDAM BAAs may not be putting the EDAM BAAs on the same footing with the ISO if we can't do that for the ISO. So I have a little bit of I have some concerns regarding what to do on this area, but it's clear that we don't want to co-optimize these products in this tool. For the ramp rates, of course, we're going to look into the possibility of supporting ramp rates, MSGs. These are all complicated elements. I am concerned that the more we move into that direction and the more time this tool will take, then we start compromising its objective. It's supposed to be a fast tool. If the participant initiates this on-demand test and it takes 10, 20 minutes to get the results, it's really cutting into the time that they have to cure any insufficiencies. So we start getting diminishing returns. And, we have to, all of us here, try to reach an agreement on what makes sense going down in that direction. But we're open to listen to what people have to say and how important these things are for them to have a reasonably effective resource sufficiency evaluation test here. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And maybe before I go to Robert, so you brought up a good point. And, I know Mark Rothleader came on a few weeks back, and not to verbatim quote him or anything, stated that the ISO is committed to designing a fair and comprehensive RSC for all EDAM entities, which include the California ISO. So, with this AS co-optimization point you made, it's my understanding that some resources within the California BAA do self-provide. So is there a middle ground opportunity where for the ISO BA, it would only look at the self-provided AS and take that off the top like you would for all other entities?
We could. I just don't see the point of doing a half job on this because, you can take care of the ancillary service provision, but then you will still ignore ancillary service bids. And more importantly, in my view, is not the ancillary services, it's the imbalance reserve bids, because ancillary service capacity doesn't even have to be under a bid in the day-ahead market. We can take it from the top and maybe it won't even touch the bid if all the capacity of the resource is not in the market. But the imbalance reserve is a different story. Imbalance reserve bids do overlap with energy bids because we co-optimize this too. So if this tool is not going to be a market and we're not going to co-optimize and we have separate tests for simply the imbalance reserve and the ancillary services, that makes more sense to me. If we start trying to find how we can do some things here and not the others, I think we have an approach that it doesn't go all the way. There's a few steps in that direction, and I don't know how useful will that be and may not be equitable. So I'm a little bit concerned about that.
Thank you. All right, let's go to Robert.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, this is Robert Elizo from WAPA. I share the sentiments of Petar on the weighted average flat ramp rates. I think it does say weighted, but we serve our loads based on how they shape, how they are shaped. So if we're using flat ramp rates, that might, not work well for WAPA's resources. So if there's a way for us to, I guess, make an assessment first how this proposal will work and not limiting to certain resources, I think that would be great. Otherwise, I think we should consider to use the ramp rates as they are.
Okay. Thank you for your comments, Robert. Jeff Spires.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Go ahead, Jeff.
Great. Good afternoon. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Just a couple of thoughts on this, George. First of all, I do like this. I think this is an interesting idea and has merit. So I'm glad that you're proposing that we continue to look at this. Just a couple of thoughts related to Petar's comments earlier. With respect to the ancillary services, I had a similar reaction, and I recognize that you want to avoid some of the complexity of trying to co-optimize for these different products and keep it as simple as possible. But on the other hand, I think what I understand Petar was getting at was we also want to avoid double counting or having a situation where the amount of capacity being counted towards the energy wasn't sufficient to cover that obligation as well as the ancillary services simultaneously. So it seems like, at a minimum, there should be some kind of validation that the total capacity being used in a given hour is sufficient to cover not only the energy, but the ancillary services and imbalance reserve quantity, so that even if it's not a perfect optimization of which resources are carrying which products, you have some comfort that there's enough capacity overall to meet all of those different elements. So I guess the bottom line is I don't think that they can be ignored entirely, but recognize your concern to try to keep it as simple as possible. The second comment, just with respect to which constraints are included versus not, I kind of like the perspective Petter had around striving for as accurate as possible, but I also assume that if we were to go down this road, we'd get a chance to back test some of this and look at what it produces and try to then compare that to the actual operating capability of some of these resources to see whether there are certain constraints versus others that tend to produce results that you wouldn't really expect. And maybe some of that back testing would be useful to kind of pick and choose which constraints do we think are necessary to get an accurate picture and which ones can we maybe avoid. So anyhow, that's just a thought.
I appreciate those thoughts. And Jeff, while your line's unmuted, Michelle, if you don't mind keeping Jeff unmuted, just because I have a question to pose for, maybe George, Danny at the ISO, and Jeff. So, I hear this AS being a potential concern around, double counting or giving too much credit towards the RSC. Given some of the AS standards across the WEC, does it make sense to potentially have the RSE target be increased by the associated AS requirement percentage, and then see, without looking at AS, see if an entity then meets that based on the bid range? Would that be a middle ground?
You're asking a question to me, Mark?
Yeah, I just the panel, or not panel, excuse me, Jeff, Danny. I don't know if Danny's line's unmuted, or go for it, George. But I'm just thinking out loud here, to keep it fair.
Clear. So for imbalance reserve, it's clear because imbalance reserve is fungible with energy, and we do include the imbalance reserve requirements, which is the uncertainty, along with the demand forecast as the target. So our target already includes an uncertainty, which is the requirement for imbalance reserves. For ancillary services in the day-ahead market specifically, it's a little tricky because, as I said earlier, it doesn't require an energy bid to be procured as a service, as a capacity service in the day ahead. So you could potentially have a 100 megawatt resource bidding into the market for energy up to 80 megawatts and bidding ancillary services of 20 megawatts. And you could have an outcome where the resource is scheduled for energy at 80 megawatts and has 20 megawatt an ancillary service, or let's say contingency reserve, for the portion of the capacity from 80 to 100. Or it's possible that the optimization will result in an outcome where the resource is only scheduled for energy at 90, having a 20 megawatt contingency reserve on top of 90, in which case 10 megawatt out of the ancillary service capacity overlaps with the energy bid. So in the former case, ignoring the ancillary services would be okay for the test because we're still using the entire energy bid range. In the latter case, it won't be because the 10 megawatt of capacity is already earmarked for ancillary services as a result of the market, mind you, which we haven't run yet, so we don't know that. In which case, counting for the 10 megawatt of capacity in the sufficiency test is not going to be accurate. But you heard my if in my conditional statement. We haven't run the market yet, so we don't know where the ancillary service is going to be. For EDAM BAAs that we don't optimize ancillary services on day one, so temporarily then, we can make that assessment because ancillary services are already spoken out. We don't wait for the market to run to tell us where they're going to be. For the ISO, that's not the case. We don't know where the ancillary services are going to be, say for self-provision, but if we optimize ancillary services with energy, we don't know where they're going to be, so we don't know about this overlap. The only way to know is to simulate the market and actually optimize ancillary services with energy, meeting both requirements, ancillary services and demand forecast plus uncertainty, so essentially running a mini market. So it's really difficult to go around this. I think we have to bite the bullet and decide, is it accurate enough to assume that there's no overlap between these capacities and perform the test simply without running a mini market, or really running a mini market and we don't know where we're going to end with that, how long it will take and how complicated it will be. So These are the real challenging questions here.
Okay, thank you, George. Jeff, did you have a response to that? I asked you the same question as well. Then I'll move on to Alba.
Sure, and I'm just kind of thinking this, of course, requires more thought, but it seems like there are two different elements of this test or of this solution that we're potentially interested in. The first one is the energy schedule that this optimization produces. So looking at the constraints that are included, producing that 24-hour plan that's matched to the load forecast. I think that's a part of it. And then with respect to ancillary services and imbalance reserves above that amount, could it be as simple as saying there needs to be enough unloaded capacity on the resources that you're using as part of that plan to cover the sum of those ancillary service obligations and imbalance reserve requirements? Rather than trying to actually sort of co-optimize and schedule which resources might be carrying which product, could you just do more of a capacity check to say, is my unloaded capacity, and maybe it's limited to the resources that have a certain ramp rate so they could actually qualify for spin or what have you. Do I have enough unloaded capacity from those resources to cover that upward ancillary service plus imbalance reserve obligation? That was kind of the way I was thinking of it, but happy to hear what others think.
No, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. I see Danny Johnson from the ISO raised his hand. Let me go to Danny before we go to Alba, and then we'll move on to Alba. Go ahead, Danny.
Thanks, Mark. This is Danny Johnson from the ISO. I think what Jeff proposed seems interesting, maybe some hybrid of residual unloaded capacity less any self-provisioned AS that an EDAM or an EDAM BAA would offer. But going back to the start of this, George did mention that we could have a separate check for AS, so I kind of wanted to follow up with him and see what he envisioned for that to kind of paint the whole picture here.
Yeah, Danny, this is the simple test that I had included in earlier presentation on the capacity test, where you make sure that, for example, you have enough imbalance reserve up bids to meet your imbalance reserve up requirement, and you do this for all the capacity services. So you have enough contingency reserve bids to meet your contingency reserve requirements, etc. These bids, they also assume a certain ramp capabilities involved. So that is a separate test, and we can make sure that these requirements can be met by the bids that are provided in the market. The tricky point here is to find out what unloaded capacity, as Jeff said, is available on each resource to accommodate these capacity services before you actually run the market to award them. And this is the problem. We don't know what is the unloaded capacity unless we calculate a schedule. We calculate a schedule here without co-optimizing our services. We can perform a test after that to find out if there's enough unloaded capacity in the resource to accommodate capacity services. But now this is after the test. We can't be doing this iteratively. I think if we're going to go down this path, we might as well run a mini market and co-optimize ancillary services, imbalance reserve, and energy to meet all the requirements. And I hear that, basically out of these 5 bullets here, so far I haven't heard anything on the first 2, which is a good thing. But I think you guys are challenging the last 3. And I was expecting some challenges. So let's see what the discussion is going to be here and where we're going to go.
So, George, would it be fair almost to say you view this as kind of solving the energy limitation throughout the day problem and determining that would be feasible, but then separately we would almost have hourly bid checks to make sure that there was enough energy bids and AS bids to meet the obligations hour by hour?
Right. I was thinking of separating the problem instead of trying to optimize all of this in a coupled form. So that's the dilemma here, right? So how much do you lose doing it separately? Yes, there may be some capacity that is doing double surveys, so you're losing a little bit of accuracy, but then again, you gain on the fact that you don't run a market by optimizing all the services, trying to come up with a complete schedule in both energy, balance reserves, and ancillary services. Again, if this is the direction we need to go, we want to go, we will look into that. I mean, we're flexible. Again, the only thing that we need to keep in mind here is that the more we go down that path, the less likely it will become that we'll be able to deliver what you want, which is an on-demand application to do this, or if we deliver it, it will be useful. Because if it's going to take too long to run, I don't think it will be useful. So we'll have to find the silver lining here.
Thank you, George and Danny. All right, let me go to Alba. So Mark, I appreciate your patience. Oh, go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I just have one observation, and maybe we can solicit some stakeholder feedback. What is the timeline on which this would have to be run for this to be useful for stakeholders? I heard Pitar put out that 3 to 5 minutes would be great. I mean, when the bilateral trading starts early in the morning, between then and 10 p.m., like how many advisory runs would potential BAAs look to do to then have curing periods? I think understanding that would help us frame just what we could potentially pack into this type of a solution.
Right. Like, meaning, you know, does it suffice to be able to run 2 on-demand RSC advisory runs per hour leading up to the 9 a.m., you know, final advisory run? Is that where you're going?
Yeah. Just understanding what the expectation. We say on demand, and 5 minutes is great, but is that a requirement that potential BAAs think they might need to adequately participate in cure for the RSC?
Okay, thank you, Danny. All right, Alba.
Hello, this is Alba Svoboda at PG&E. I'll push in the other direction from Pitar. I think this is a really good idea, George, because it basically takes the bid-only calculation, and as Danny pointed out, brings in some optimization of the energy limited resources, which was really the concern brought up previously. So I think it's addressing those concerns. And I like the simplification of the model because essentially it looks to me like you're turning the entire model into a very simple LP, where essentially the information that's required to solve the linear program is going to be available to each BAA in the bid set that it provides to CAISO. And so that has 2 features. One is that the solution is basically instant or within seconds, but also that it is a problem that potentially a model that BAAs could solve internally to see where they are at any point in time in meeting the RSC requirement, and thereby the feature of the other approach that was being suggested of RSCs coming up with their own plan can be addressed through this approach. Essentially, the RSC can construct its bid set, know that it's going to satisfy the RSC in advance, and then be able to provide those to the CAISO with full confidence. And so there's not this, what happens with the introduction of non-convexities and integer variables is that there's never certainty really until you do that 9 a.m. run that you're actually able to meet the RSC. So I think that's an important feature that you're introducing here, which I think could be very beneficial to this process. I think the AS issue really deserves more thought than just simply trying to come up with solutions on the spot, but I basically agree with the approach that Jeff was talking about. And I think if you could essentially, again, think of it in some form of linearization of the energy bids so that you can sort of essentially disregard bids that are only for AS as you were describing it, but allow an energy bid to be capable of satisfying either an energy or an AS requirement in a linearized form. I think it actually could be brought into this model, and you could solve the sufficiency for both at the same time. Now, obviously, if you're missing a bunch of AS, that's a problem, and so you'd have to figure out how to back the hard cases into that. But I think it just requires more design work than just talking about it. I do think it's a promising approach, though, like I said, to have a linear program that essentially anybody could run on their own system iteratively before coming to the KAISO could be very beneficial.
Thank you, Alva. George, did you have a response to that before I move to Bobby Olson?
No, I think these are good comments. I appreciate. Ancillary services is still concerning me. If we're optimizing ancillary services like in the ISO case, we don't know which resource is going to be carrying the service. So even if we could earmark their bid as been awarded and try to find out how much it overlaps that award, the potential award starting from the upper capability limit going down, to find out what overlap with the balance with the energy bidder is, so that we can take it out for the sufficiency here. We are not sure which resource is going to provide the service, so we can't be doing it indiscriminately for all resources. It's not going to be fair to the BAA, to the ISO BAA here, because we'll be cutting out energy bid that could be used for passing the test. So in my view, the only way to do this is to actually throw into this model the ancillary service procurement without any cost, just the range, just the bids, and the requirements to make sure that the optimization model will actually allocate the ancillary services to meet the requirement in resources, and then will actually essentially co-optimize ancillary service and energy. So that will be the 201 version of this algorithm here. That's the only way that I see this is possible to do, and that's the only way to do it for imbalanced reserves as well. So I'm taking some notes here.
George, does that also, for my own knowledge, does this take the performance hit that you laid out for as a concern earlier on?
It's just additional constraints and equations. I don't think this is the problem. The problem comes when you start introducing binary variables. And just to Alba, he said linear, but it's not linear because of the storage resources. They do have a binary variable to separate charging and discharging, because they are not symmetric. They're not linear. The transition, because of the charging efficiency, that is not 100%. So we do have integer variables in this, so it's going to be actually a mixed integer programming solution, which, the more binary variables you throw in, then we start to be concerned with the integrality gap and all these issues that they come with integer variables. If we can keep the binaries from the other introduction, like the dynamic ramp rates, the MSGs, then we're in a good shape. We can do this ancillary service optimization. My concern is when we start talking about having dynamic ramp rates, there's a lot of binaries for that, or MSG states, there are binaries for that, and then this is getting to be a pretty serious mixed integer programming, even if it's a small size, like one BAA at a time. It's not going to be a few seconds, we're talking a few minutes. In my view, if it takes more than 5 minutes, I start thinking it's not as useful, but that's me.
Thank you, George. And again, I believe Danny brought that question up, and Bobby, maybe when you provide your comments weighing in, if you wouldn't mind just opining on the topic of, if you're, as an EDAM BAA, if you're constrained to only being able to run this, say, 2-3 times per hour, is that a concern for you? Michelle, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Bobby's line, I'd like to hear from Bobby.
Hi, Bobby Olson with SRP. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the conversation. Really good so far. In terms of the direct question there, Mark, I tend to agree with where George is at in terms of having, as an EDAM BA, the opportunity to run that kind of ad hoc on demand with kind of a presumable runtime of no more than 5 minutes, because under most scenarios I would expect we're going to be running it maybe 2 or 3 times before we get to an operating day, but on those days that we know that we're going to be a little constrained, whether it's because of outage or load or anything else, we're going to want the ability to kind of run it more frequently and understand kind of, are we positioning the system and moving it appropriately to make sure that we can really kind of comply and meet the requirements here. And I think the ability to run it more frequently in order to gain greater confidence that we'll be able to participate and bring the necessary requirements to the market, I think that's important. In terms of the test, I think really good discussion. Understand where Petter's coming from when he's putting that forward. I would just step back and say, I think from an RS perspective, I think simple makes sense. We are not running the market here, and I want to make sure that we're kind of thinking about what we're trying to accomplish. Before we get to a spot where we'd be putting together bids and anything here, we're running through our own optimizer, trying to make sure that we've got solvable components behind this. So I would envision that most of the BAs that are coming to the table in this particular case, using even a simplified approach, while you might see weighted average ramp rates and those, and might not have transmission constraints, the reality is that all the BAs should be working to ensure that those are addressed as part of developing that optimized plan, so that even if we're only putting energy bids into the market, those should still be effectively captured to the point in time that we get the kind of actual market participation and those things get trued out. Let's see it. And the last comment I would make in terms of ancillary services, I think what Jeff suggested may be a reasonable perspective here, but I do want to keep it simple. SRP believes or kind of agrees with the concept of not necessarily co-optimizing ancillary services at this point in time. We think those are a function of the BA, and leaving them out of this is not necessarily a bad thing from an RS perspective. We recognize that they'll have to be identified as part of kind of full-blown bids and market participation, but I think at least from RS, that may not be something that we would want to complicate, because we see that more as kind of an OAT type process requirement definition than here. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Bobby. Reaction to that, George, or would you like me to move on to Steve?
You can move on.
All right. So what I heard was Bobby at SRP and Alva at PG&E seem to be tracking very similarly in the vote of keeping it simple, and that BAAs should already be accounting for these constraints and AS in their plans. So let's go to Steve.
Thanks, Steve Kearns from the Public Generating Pool. What I'm curious about kind of builds off of the point that Bobby just made about how BAs and market participants do their own optimization already in the day ahead. So what I'm curious about, is there an opportunity for a BA or a market participant to use their own optimization rather than what you're proposing here?
So before you respond, George, I would just caution. So I hear what you're saying, Steve, but kind of going back to some of those starting points with the principles is about a fair and equitable RSC across all EDAM BAAs. I would question whether or not that principle holds steady in that conceptual design that you just threw out there. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I was trying to say the same thing, Mark. Basically, we want to have the same platform applied to every BAA in the market. I think by allowing every EDAM entity to use their own process will probably put the BAAs at different footing. I don't think that will be aligned with the objectives here. And it raises a lot of other issues. We have to have this model being audited. It may not conform with our data model, who knows? So I think it's a complicated scenario. We should agree on having one platform here for everybody.
Steve, Michelle, do you mind unmuting Steve's line? I don't know if he was finished. Sorry about that, Steve. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't understand why this puts different BAs on different footings or levels, right? The goal here is to supply an accurate resource plan that meets your obligations, and whether a BA does it with their own tools or whether with the KISO tool, the outcome is the same. It's a resource plan that meets the obligations.
The objective is the same, but the mechanism may be different. Each model is different in the way it accounts for constraints, how it models constraints. So from one model to another, there are differences. So that this difference may present advantages and disadvantages across the different BAAs. So it's not going to be exactly the same how it's applied.
Yeah, and I think, Steve, your proposal or thought at least was a little more in line with the day-ahead sufficiency plan, which was one of the earlier concepts that BAs would provide this, spreadsheet, for lack of better terms, with what their operating plans were the following day and how that meets their RSE. So it's definitely something that we've been discussed, but as we started diving through some of the resource accounting rules and some of those constraints, I think that's where we landed today as a group around this optimized sufficiency portfolio.
I totally understand that. I just wonder about whether or not this might be a feature that a market participant could elect CAISO to do for them rather than to have a mandated framework that forces everybody to do that.
I see Danny with his hand up. Danny?
Steve, to follow up, are you suggesting that there could be a different mechanism to pass resource efficiency, or just that an entity could utilize whatever their own tool set is to develop their plan and then submit the bids that they think are necessary, and then I guess the CAISO could run it through a screen like this to ensure everybody had equal treatment?
Yeah.
Because ideally, is that what you were thinking?
Yes, absolutely. It's the latter of those two choices.
So just to the point where an EDAM BAA wouldn't want to run this and cure and run this and make adjustments, they would use their own tools, but then at 10 a.m., the same rule set, which would probably look potentially something like this, would be applied to each EDAM BAA. Okay. I think I understand what you're saying.
And each of the BAs that did it on their own would still have the same opportunities to cure like everybody else. It's just, well, what I worry about is the increase in complexity, and asking a BA in the Northwest that has a complex hybrid system where it takes a long time for them to do their own optimization, to have them look at another optimization in that same time frame, and to juggle two sets of data like that is asking a lot. And I don't think it's necessary if somebody's already doing their own optimization to make sure that they can meet their demand.
So, Steve, I hear you now, and I apologize. I think I'm following with what you're suggesting. So at the 9 a.m. run that was proposed, if the entity is failing that 9 a.m. run, how does that entity ensure, because they passed their own, optimization outside of this design, how does that entity then assure that they're going to meet the RSE post 9 a.m. consistent with, that run result?
I'm viewing this like a number of other commenters have viewed this. That this is an ad hoc process that BAs are doing throughout the morning, while the bilateral market is transacting. That they are doing this once an hour, maybe as Bobby suggested, multiple times an hour, to make sure that they are able to pass the resource efficiency test. And if they're not, they're buying energy or capacity in the bilateral market. And then when you get to 10 a.m. or whenever the final bids are due, you have a resource plan either developed by the BA or developed by what George is proposing that CAISO do, that would be able to demonstrate that they are able to pass.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
George, did you have a... Oh, go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry.
I just want to make sure that made sense.
No, I believe I'm following. George, did you have a comment before moving on?
Yes. I mean, this is not a screen anymore, what we're proposing here. So that approach would work well with the previous model that we were proposing, where EDAM BAAs could provide the advisory operational schedule for energy limited resources, and we use that in the resource efficiency evaluation based on the previous discussions we had. If we move into a tool like this, now this is not a screen anymore. This actually does the whole thing. So I don't see how an input of a schedule will be useful here because this tool actually calculates a schedule. So I see it as being compatible with the previous approach, but not with this one. You don't need a schedule to be submitted from a BAA to run this tool. You only need the bits, that's it.
So George and Steve, this is for my own knowledge and understanding. Is it safe to say that to the extent an EDAM BAA entity is running their own sufficiency tests, taking into account more constraints than what is being done here in this, simplification model, that chances are they would be passing this due to their own plan being more restrictive?
I'm not following.
I think that's likely, but I don't know if it's assured without knowing exactly how the KAISO's optimization algorithm is going to work.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious. Let me move on to Michelle Keto. I appreciate your patience, Michelle. Go ahead.
Hey, this is Michelle. Hey, George, could you explain how you would be treating imports, different kinds of imports, as well as export bids, both low and high priority export bids?
So imports, we have to have a slide later on, Michelle, where we're going to kind of tee up the treatment of WSPP Schedule C arrangements, as well as, other imports and what that actually looks like in the context of EDAM. George, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that or hold off.
I can respond because this one is not really recognizing the difference between import resources, export resources, or internal resources, other than, of course, the fact that imports and exports, they have, they don't have ramp rate capability constraints. So you still work with the energy bid range that an import has and an export has, and we're talking, at least until we discuss the external resource participation, we're talking about import-export bids at ISO scheduling points with non-EDAM BAAs. That's where we have imports and exports at this point in the discussion, right? So
could
I don't.
Yeah, so let me give you a question. So let's say we have 40,000 megawatts of load, and we have 10,000 megawatts, and let's say we have, let's say we have 5,000 megawatts. Let me do this. We have 40,000 megawatts of load in California, and we have 40,000 megawatts of resources. Let's say we have 5,000 megawatts of import bids and 10,000 megawatts of exports. Do we fail the resource efficiency test?
It really depends on everything else that is going into this model, but basically you're running for each BAA separately, essentially. It's a test for a given BAA. You try to find out if you can meet your demand forecast plus the uncertainty. So if it takes for that, let's say to meet demand plus upward uncertainty, if it takes to not schedule any exports and schedule all the imports, that is a feasible scenario. And this optimization model will use this scenario to say, yes, you can pass the upward test.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
Okay. And then my other question is, one of the questions you've been having is, what would a BAA do with this information? I guess two questions. Would this information be available to anyone other than the KAISO? Would it be available to the 44 LSCs in California? And what would California do with this information once they had it, if there were a failure?
Yeah, these are all good questions, Michelle. And we have pondered these questions in the past here in this work group. And I think my understanding so far from all the discussion on these topics is that we want to have this tool available for EDAM entities and the market operator for the ISO BAA to conduct. The results, I think we can publish them for everybody to know, so the LSCs would know the results, and the results being we passed the test or we failed the test in this hour by this much megawatts. so you would know what you need to do for a specific hour, how much we are short. Now, on the coordination that needs to happen within an EDAM entity and its LSCs and its customers and all that, it's a separate discussion, something that each BAA has to look into developing appropriate procedures and business models to handle that. I think we haven't touched upon here, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should leave it to each BAA to develop their own processes for getting their participants organized in curing any deficiencies that are posted out of this test.
And George, do you imagine that it would be public at every BAA level?
I don't consider that this information is confidential because we're not using the bid prices. We're only using the bid ranges, which says how much each resource participates, and we won't even publish that, but we will publish the aggregate deficiency that a BAA may have in a given hour. Like, you're short of meeting the upward target by 40 megawatts. I think this is information that we can publish. It's not confidential in any way. It has all aggregate information in it, and it's very useful in the sense that it advertises that, we need to put 40 megawatt more worth of bid range into this hour to pass the test.
Okay, thanks for your help. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the questions, Michelle. Let's go to Stuart Kelly.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, just on publishing the information, I think some consideration needs to be given to the timing of that published information, because there's opportunities to game it and spike prices if you make it available to everyone. So that's a consideration. I think, George, I appreciate where you're coming from initially, and you need to guard against constraints. I think it's a bit hard, and Honda owners, I see this more as of a ladder, quite honestly. The initial blush. I think it's worth remembering that for most shops that are optimizing, the merchant is the one that's optimizing with their software. So can't bring in, third-party information there. And one of the reasons we got to the optimization was allowing, third parties, to get their bid information and prevent them having to provide a schedule, which I think is beneficial to them. The second part is, the potential for some data problems. I know that the day ahead's not as dynamic as the real-time, data exchange we have with EIM, but there are data problems, and we want to be able to reconcile. And more importantly, as we work through the actual cure, I think most folks will find this helpful, albeit the idea that folks can opt out of this is probably something that the council would be certainly willing to, entertain. I think at de minimis, you need the MST transition rates in there and the ramp rates themselves, as well as accounting for the AS in some way. I think that would be a useful kind of minimum here, and hopefully you will agree. I don't think that's too much to ask for in terms of initial blush, and certainly maybe stuff beyond that possibly is, but I appreciate your opening gamut on this, but we'd hope to kind of move this from a ladder to a Honda. Thanks.
All right, George, any response to that, or are we? I see Danny Johnson with his hand up. Danny, did you want to make a comment? And then it looks like Robert. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I guess to Stuart's last point, I think we understand your concern about putting out information regarding how close a BAA would be to passing or failing could create concerns regarding access to supply within that BAA. I think that's something that we will consider. Back to Michelle's earlier point about the import-exports, I wanted to clarify on that a little bit. I think I understood that question to be adding on the dynamic we see in the EIM, where we run the HASP, we set export schedules, potentially based off imports or EIM transfers, and then those get tested for in the EIM's RSE. I think the EDAM RSC is a little different because we haven't actually run the market. This would be before any market run, which isn't what occurs right now in EAM. So I think on the imports, that's still an open question because the intertie bidding is still something that this process is going to have to work through. But regarding exports, there would be no exports that would be cleared via a day-ahead market process to add to the obligations. The only exports from a BAA we would expect to potentially be reflected as the bucket one bid range or IRU transfers that we've talked about.
Thank you, Danny. All right, I still see, so I'm doing a time check here. We're at about 2:14, 2:15, and I know George has a few more slides. Steve, Alva, to the extent, I know I gave you guys an opportunity earlier. To the extent you do no longer have a question, please lower your hand. George, I'm going to allow you to push forward, and then to the extent Alva's hand is still up, we'll go back to Alva. But I believe I'm hearing 2, potentially 3 options from this discussion based on what you have here. And, you know, this working group, to the extent we can't all come to, you know, a common consensus on one approach, that is okay. You know, the ISO can put forth in their proposal a few options and then work this out through the stakeholder process. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to George and allow George to continue through his slide deck. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So continuing this in the slide deck, I just want to show you a little bit the mathematical formulation without going into details. It will give you a little bit of better understanding of what we mean. So I use the same terminology more or less that I have used in other technical documents. You're familiar with it. But the 2 variables that I introduced here is the X and Y. X is the high potential schedule that is calculated to meet the upward target, and Y is the low potential schedule over the resources in the BA that is trying to meet the low target. And those targets have the demand plus the upward and downward uncertainty. E is the daily energy limit we use for hydro resources. Small e is the state of charge that we use for batteries. The charging efficiency for the batteries that, as I mentioned earlier, it introduces a nonlinearity that requires some binary variables, so this is a milk problem. And these are the variables that we use to relax the requirement constraints, the upward capability shortfall if you have one, and the downward capability shortfall via W. These are really, we'll show in the next slide how they come into the picture. And we may need some more binary variables when we discuss alternatives for what the objective function is. But everything starts here. These are the 2 main constraints, what we're trying to do. So we want to make sure that there is enough schedule, those X's that I mentioned earlier, that if you add up all the schedules in a given hour, you try to meet the upward target, which is the demand forecast plus upward uncertainty. And if you cannot meet that in any hour, then there is some shortfall. That variable here is the relaxation of that constraint, right? And similarly for the downward requirement, you calculate a low schedule that tries to meet the low requirement of demand forecast minus downward uncertainty, all right? And if you cannot meet that, again, you may have to relax it. So if these relaxation values take no value over the entire day, then you pass the test. And if they take value in an hour or more, then it tells you how short you are in that hour, and you failed the test in that hour. Both schedules, they start from the same common initial condition. So this is the basic mechanism. And these are the constraints that we're going to add on the left side here. These are all the known constraints that we have, the capacity constraints that both X and Y have to be within the energy bid, they have to be feasible. And the temporal constraints for the ramp capability changes across hours, both for the X and for the Y schedule. They have to be contained within the 60-minute ramp capability of the resource. Okay, and we're using flat ramp rates, not dynamic ramp rates. Will be a change in the model to use dynamic ramp rates. So as I said earlier, these are very high performance intensive constraints if we want to go that route. So I'm just showing the simple model here. And this is why we're doing all this. We're doing this to make sure that energy constraints are satisfied, all right, so that both X and Y are feasible with respect to energy limitations. So the low schedule has to be feasible with the lower daily energy limit, and the high schedule with the high daily energy limit for hydro resources, for example. This low limit can be negative for pumped storage hydro, by the way. So, but these are the aggregate values. Okay, they're aggregated, the same constraints here for the state of charge of batteries. So both the state of charge for the X schedule and the state of charge for the Y schedule, they have to be within the SOC limits of the resource. Now, to enforce this constraint, we need to relate the SOC with the schedule itself, and that's what the storage model does here. This is the same model that we have in production. You probably have seen it in my technical documents for the day-ahead market enhancements in the real time. It's not different. I'm not going to go through it. It's essentially models of storage resources having potentially either a discharge schedule or a charge schedule, and there's a binary variable that controls the fact that you can only have one or the other. The battery can either charge or discharge. And then it's an intertemporal constraint that says monitors how the SOC builds up or depletes depending on how the schedule is a discharge schedule or a charge schedule. So with this storage model, then we have the ability to enforce these SOC constraints. Let me see. And then we'll talk a little bit about the objective function. What are we trying to accomplish here, right? So we want to minimize all your shortfalls. That's the first alternative objective function that we can have in this tool. So as I said earlier, V and W are the relaxations of the constraints for the upward and downward target. If you can't meet that target, if it's impossible with the constraints that we have in the problem, you either don't have enough bids or you don't have sufficient ramp capability in the market, and you need to relax that constraint that meets the target in any hour, then these values will take a value other than zero, and then we'll try to minimize that across the day. So if it ends up that they're all zero across the day, then you pass the test and you're all good. And otherwise, this may take values that the upward relaxation or the downward relaxation will take a value, will show you how much is your shortfall in that particular hour. And this is the best possible outcome that you can have through this model, right? So this model will optimize both the upward and downward schedule, trying to meet this objective to be zero. All right. So if it can't be zero, then it will give you the lowest possible amount of violation across the day. We'll tell you, here's what you need to pay attention. You have a shortfall, and this is how much the shortfall is, so you know what actions you need to take to cure that. Of course, this objective minimizes the total volume of relaxation, the total volume of the shortfall over the trading day. There's no information here with this objective to convey the fact that maybe I want to minimize the number of hourly violations. I'm not so much interested in the volume, but the occurrence. Maybe I want to fail the test in the least possible amount of hours, okay? And if you want to go in that direction, then it becomes a little bit more difficult. We need to introduce binary variables that take value whenever any of these relaxation variables take value, and then we minimize the sum of those violations. These are hourly violations. So basically, if this is zero, you pass the test in all the hours. If it's 1 and couldn't go below 1, that means you fail 1 hour, either in the upward or in the downward direction. So this tries to minimize the number of hours that you fail, but maybe in these hours, the amount of violation is large. So, you know, you have these alternatives. Do you want to minimize the total volume of the violation, which makes it easy to cure the problem? You have less capacity to bring into the market, or you focus on minimizing the number of hourly violations, but you may have a large violation that are maybe more difficult to cure that problem. From an optimization perspective, this is a more difficult problem to solve. We avoid having integer objective functions, definitely in a market, because you can't calculate marginal prices. This is a discrete It's not a continuous objective function. Of course, in this problem, we're not calculating any marginal costs and any marginal prices, so it's not an issue. But this is the convergence properties with this objective function are a lot more challenging. My recommendation would be to go with this, which is also will provide more useful information in the sense that you may have a little action to take to cure the problem in the hours that you fail. The other element here is that these objective functions, both of them, they don't put any weighting on the different hours, so they weigh each hour the same. But you could potentially add weighting factors, both of them, to basically, it's more important here, to maybe stress the fact that, I'm more interested in passing the upward test, not so much the downward test, or I'm more interested in passing the test in peak hours rather than off-peak hours. So you can do things like that. So I'm just going to show it here what you can do and what capabilities you have, and I want to close by summarizing all the properties that this model has. So as we said here, it's executed for each DAA separately, all right? And when we are going to formally execute it for all DAAs, these calculations can be done in parallel, so there's a parallelization that helps the performance here. What is important here for what we're trying to accomplish is that both the upward and the downward capability are co-optimized here. This model will actually co-optimize between the X and the Y. We'll calculate both schedules simultaneously to pass both upward and downward tests. So it makes the proper trade-off between those two, trying to minimize all the shortfalls. So you get the best possible outcome. So you have simultaneously both the upward and the downward test. And it's a single test for both capacity and flexibility because the upcome rate constraints are enforced as constraints in the model. So you know that you can meet your capacity target without violating your upgrades, your upgrade capability. So essentially you can perform one test that does everything. Capacity, flexibility, upward and downward, just one test does the whole thing here. It has the ability to identify the hourly failures and the hourly shortfalls that could then give you the ability to cure these hours by bringing additional capacity into the market in these hours. And as I mentioned, it also has the ability to, apply weighting factors if you have if you want to place increased importance on a certain hours, like the peak hours, or in a certain direction, upward or downward. So I'm going to open for questions here, and I just want to say that this is just an initial thing that we put together to give you some context on how this will look like. There's more discussion, obviously, to be had here. We got some feedback already about the simplifications that we have in. We'll take all that. And we will carefully examine the potentially how we can make it better. But I wanted to start from somewhere, and that somewhere wanted to be the bare minimum and simple possible that we can have. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Great presentation. Alva, let me go to Alva, and then I'll pose a few questions to the audience here. Thank you for your patience, Alva. Go ahead.
Not at all. Thank you, Mark. I really like this direction, George, and I think even with some of the additional complexities people are asking for, it might well be feasible. Two sort of fine points on this. One is that it may be that the set of bids that's used in running this may not be the same as the set of bids that go into the actual market run. As you stated, there may be additional resources that are being found to resolve the market, and that in itself means the final set is not going to be the same as the set that's used here. But the other thing that was brought up by some people at PG&E looking at this is the issue of outages and how you would capture the fact that some bids may be limited by derates or outages that wouldn't show up in the raw bid set itself. So that would be one area to look at. I don't think it changes anything in terms of the model or the solvability of the model, but it would change some things in terms of how the data was made available to this model. The other
Alba, can I ask?
Yeah.
The outages will reflect them in this upper economic limit, so the capacity constraints will reflect the outages, so we will not count capacity under the bid that is not available because of an outage. That's relatively simple to do. If we know the outage.
So you're saying you would process the bids and then apply the outages to them?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then that sounds like a solution to that. The other thing is the battery model currently, the initial state of charge is critical to the solution here. That's a bid parameter. That's not it's a forecast, obviously, so it's not a physical parameter. And so you have an issue there.
Yeah, we need to know the initial state of charge submitted as an input, the same with the initial schedule.
Right. But with storage, it's even more of it's simply a bid parameter. As you pointed out last week when we were discussing initial state of the resource is highly constrained by the previous day's solution. State of charge is not necessarily because of the real-time activity that might happen on the battery. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind in looking at this. But I think it's a really, especially with, as you mentioned, the possibility of putting weightings in the objective function to address periods which are considered to be most important for the resource efficiency evaluation. I think this has a lot of potential. So thank you for all the work you put into this.
You're welcome, Alva.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments there, Alva. Let me go to Peter.
Hey, George, can you go back to slide with objectives?
Yes. Oh, the objective function, right? This one?
Yeah. Well, there is really no need to change objective, which is the same as the market objective. Again, if you want to really achieve, as I said before, and I don't know where you're going to go with JJ, I'm looking forward to hear about that. But you have a golden opportunity if you run market objective to reach a reasonably good equivalent to EIM base points that you can use for GAG and export around that if you pivot around those. So I would highly recommend that you consider using minimum cost since you already have bids and everything, and that will kind of be a good measure of where utility would be if they optimize on their own, take into account all the bilateral other things they want to do. Okay, and it's not going to be much more difficult to solve. And in every hour where you have infeasibility, you're failing that hour, and you have measures to capture all the infeasibility, the balance equation or whatever, right? So you can use the same mechanisms to find out in which hour you're failing and why you're failing. Now, going back to performance, I hear a lot of concerns about performance and this and that. And I know that by now you're solving probably one IFM pass or one NPM pass when you have 3 iterations in about 20 to 30 minutes, right? And because you have to run market 2 times in worst case scenario between 10 a.m. and noon, so you have to be around 20 to 30 minutes per IFM or NPM pass. And in one IFM or one NPM pass, you're solving a problem like RSC, more complex, at least 3 times plus network stuff. So you are, relatively there in that range of 5 to 10 minutes. So instead of, being concerned that we cannot solve it and kind of simplify problem because we are afraid that we cannot solve it, I would rather see you to see how much you can fit into, 5, 10 minutes, whatever is reasonable for people to keep running this. Because more accurate you are, better you are protecting against leaning. Because whatever you don't do accurately, potentially in this RSC, may inadvertently result in leaning. And the key point of this tool is not to be simple, is not to be fast. It is to be as accurate as you can make it within available time.
Peter, I agree that we can make it more accurate, but I don't see the point using the bid prices to do an economic optimization. That's not our objective to run a market here, right? We just want to see if there is a possibility to pass the test or not. So I think the objective is different than the market. We're not really interested in positioning resources and schedule them optimally. We're just going to make sure that there is a feasible schedule at any price, doesn't matter the price, that they can pass the test, right?
George, you know that if you use feasibility equal price functions, it's going to be a much more difficult problem to solve for MIP. It's going to take much longer time, because if you have discrete differences in bid prices, which are natural to resources, it's going to be easier for MIP to solve even in this simplified case. So any other objective you take, like equal movement or any other one, is going to be much more for MIP to solve, much more difficult for MIP to solve.
Well, it's a trade-off, right? Because yes, the price information can make your problem more convex, so you have better convergence properties, but then you have to spend extra effort with the different segments on the bid. You see, the bid is not one price; it's different segments, and then we have to model that. I don't see this as useful here in this effort. We just want to find a schedule that passes the test, not really the optimal schedule. The market will do that next, right?
Yeah, we'll see when you start doing GAG where you end up. That will define what you need to do here.
Yeah. Let's see what GAG.
Yeah, let's hold GHG for that appropriate working group. I appreciate your comments, Peter. So before we move on, George, I appreciate the way you articulated this approach. I really want to so I heard from SRP, and I believe they were in line and agree with this simplistic approach, and I'm hearing from stakeholders there may need to be a variation for, consideration of AS and at what level and how. I heard the question around transparency with the results, what makes sense to provide and to who. And then I also heard a few times the test needs to be, obviously accurate, but also for it to be on demand, it needs to be relatively quick leading up to that 0900 10 o'clock cutoff. So let me get a gauge from the audience if other entities wouldn't mind raising their hand and, is this an approach that you feel is appropriate and in line with the objectives for EDAM? Or do you feel this approach misses the mark and the ISO and stakeholders need to go back to the drawing board to potentially come up with another one? So Northwest entities, California entities, please raise your hand. I see Paul Wood from Pacific Core. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I concur. I think I like this approach you guys are heading down and proposing. I guess I was a little bit perplexed, with the AS. I think it would make sense to optimize the AS as well as, the energy bids. So that would be my only immediate thought.
Okay, thank you. So some level of accounting for AS to ensure, double counting and things like that. Let me hear from Kevin Smith.
Definitely.
Yeah, I honestly, Kevin Smith Bank, I don't have anything really to add. And by the way, I'm obligated as a lawyer to fall asleep when George pulls out the math. So, but I do, I think we support the concept. We run our own optimization in the BA, and so I appreciate some of the discussions that went around that. But yeah, I think we're on the right track, and we like it. We want to have tools, so we can test ourselves along the way. And I guess the bottom line is, and kind of going to what Peter has raised, is at the end of the day, it's got to be meaningful. It's got to actually provide information that is meaningful. So to the extent we start throwing extraneous things and it loses its ability because it becomes too complex. So there's going to be a tension, but the general direction we're going, we really like it and support it. So thanks, George and others, for the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that, Kevin. So Steve Kearns earlier brought up the, to the extent the EDAM entity wants to perform their own evaluation, I believe the ISO answer to that was, by all means, go for it. But at 0900, that entity is going to be held to the same tests that all other EDAM entities are held to. So I think there's, to the extent a EDAM entity chooses not to execute these, advisory tests prior to the 0900 run, that's definitely a choice they can make and utilize their own. Let me see if I can get someone from maybe Idaho, Portland. I'd like to hear from the northwest. Anybody willing to comment? I see Jeff Spires. Go ahead, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I think this concept also has merit, as others have pointed out. Just listening more to the discussion and having George walk through the objective function and the various constraints, I think it makes some sense. I would probably just reiterate what I said before, which is I think ultimately, for this kind of approach to work, we have to be comfortable that it's producing an outcome that's realistic and that we think is reasonably accurate. And so, yeah, I think it's an open question which constraints would be necessary to achieve that. So, not really opining on the list of kind of which constraints are in and which are out that George was referring to, but just, I think, recognizing that we need some way to evaluate the results of the optimization to be able to validate that they're realistic. And, I think what Alva was explaining before about one approach to incorporate ancillary services seemed to make sense to me. I think that that's going to be important here. If this is becoming a capacity evaluation in a given hour, then it's important to make sure that all of the capacity obligations are accounted for when you're doing that assessment. So I think finding a way to incorporate that is going to be necessary. But, in general, I think we should continue to pursue this concept and develop it further. But, that being said, I think just listening to some of the comments Petter had, I think that, his suggestions were intriguing as well. So, it could be that talking a little bit more about a full, how far can we push towards a more comprehensive solution might be worth exploring in more detail.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate your comments. Let's go to Carrie.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Thanks for this presentation, walking through the constraints, George. Like Petter, I think this will probably be tied to the GHG proposal. So it would be helpful to know, maybe not on this call, but on the holistic call you're going to do, whether this test is both compatible and efficient under, the major GHG proposals. So I see this as being very compatible with the hurdle rate, for instance, but if you go with a hybrid or a out-of-market accounting, I see this as less compatible. So just keeping those in mind, I think would be helpful.
Carrie, let me answer this. I don't think this has anything to do whether you're doing a hurdle rate approach or not. This could potentially give you a schedule that you can demonstrate that you're using as your operational schedule for meeting your own needs without displacement, without economic displacement from the actions of EDAM. And in that sense, if we go with Petter's suggestion that, we actually do a mini optimization, a mini market here with the bids and everything, it's also an economic schedule, we could use that as equivalent to a base schedule that we use in the EIM greenhouse gas model if we leverage the same model for use in EDAM. That approach here could actually provide us with the primary dispatch. When it comes to the other approach for greenhouse gas based on the hurdle rate, I don't think this is relevant at all. It doesn't do anything. You don't even need a schedule for that approach. So, I mean, these are more discussions that we need to have in the working group 3. But yes, there is a link here with potentially this approach that could be used if we change it a little bit, not the way I present it here, if we change it to actually provide an economic schedule that we can use as a reference, as the primary dispatch for the greenhouse gas model, which has resource-specific attributions. I think that's what Peter was suggesting.
Thanks, George. Yeah, that is what I meant. I meant if you go with the hurdle rate, then really it doesn't matter what constraints you choose in this test, and they're completely disconnected. But if you don't, you go the other method, then I think we need to talk a lot more about how to make this useful as a base schedule. So yeah, that was my point. Thank you.
Agree. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other entities? I see Justin Thompson from APS. Go ahead, Justin.
Hello, I just want to thank George for putting this together, and APS supports this approach. It looks fair and simple, and I think it accomplishes the objectives and the principles that we set forward. So thanks, George.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. So looking at the time, we're at about 2:45. I see Peter's hand up. So Peter, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Go for it.
Well, I want to agree with George. I want to address discussion about ancillary services. There are at least 3-4 different ways that it can be easily done. All of them will work. George mentioned UN optimization with lost opportunity cost without bids. We can do what we are doing in EIM. You can put in some constraints on spin and non-spin to kind of limit total capacity based on bids. So there are multiple solutions. That's the easiest part of complication. I would not worry about that. And when I mentioned this related to GAG, it may be related if you decide to go with resource-based approach instead of GAG zone approach, but there is plenty of time to talk about that. We just need to, in my opinion, again, see what is the maximum we can do within the time we want to dedicate to this, 5 or 10 minutes, whatever.
Thanks, Peter.
Justin, did you have another comment, or is your hand, did you mean to leave your hand up?
Trying to lower it. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. All right, I did not hear from Idaho. Kathy, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I would like to get your reaction to this proposal. Kathy Anderson.
Yeah, you know, I'll admit I've just been kind of listening in and kind of thinking about it, and I'm still thinking about it. So I guess I can't really give you much of a reaction beyond that at the moment.
No worries. Thank you. I appreciate your comment there. All right. Thank you, George. I appreciate you laying this out. I think you have a plan for, how to incorporate AS and at what level to ensure we keep things, simple and meeting the objective for participants.
Yes, as I said, this is the Honda model. I'm going to start building the Cadillac next.
Thank you for the analogy. And for the record, there's nothing wrong with the Honda because that is what I drive. All right. That's right. A to B. All right. So and maybe I'll hold off. So we kind of already teed up WSPP Schedule C arrangements. So, I would really like to see and hear from entities on how they feel, what level, of certainties around these WSPP Schedule Cs. From last week's call, it sounded like there was, a high confidence level that they were going to show up. So with that in mind, and with respect to, some of the starting point for some of the principles around, honoring and respecting some of these IRP and RA programs, how do these WSPP Schedule C arrangements get counted towards RSC? Let's hold answering that for today's call. Maybe we'll dive into it a bit more next week. I've been working with a few entities offline, and I appreciate everyone responding back to me. So I will be calling on you to kind of help frame up and providing some education to the audience on what some of these look like, and really diving into ensure, everyone agrees that these should be accounted for and that the accreditation makes sense. So I'm just going to pause there. I'm going to pass it over to Bob. One more thing before I do. It looks like we made great progress today on the evaluation framework. I think George has a little bit of homework to do, and maybe we'll carve out a little bit of time next week when George is ready to show the audience how the ISO proposes to account for AS. And to the extent we get, common consensus on that, I would really like to start diving into some of the discussion around I just lost my mind. To the extent someone fails the RSC, what do those consequences look like? So something to start thinking about heading into next week. With that, let me turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, Mark. So we started with, I'll give you a reminder about we're only having one meeting this week, as Mark just alluded to, referring to our next meeting next week. And then we dove into the RSC framework review, where Mark talked about all frameworks having some things in common, like evaluating the day-ahead sufficiency across the full 24-hour horizon, testing for both capacity and flexibility, allowing on-demand RSC runs by the EDAM entity, and that the final scheduled advisory run would be at 9 a.m. With inputs locked at this time. And then we reviewed the different frameworks that we've been discussing, the day-ahead sufficiency plan, where each entity submits a day-ahead load resource plan with commensurate bids, and then the hybrid bid schedule sufficiency demonstrated through bids with a new advisory operating schedule component. And then, of course, the one we've been talking about today, the optimized sufficiency portfolio with frameworks utilizes submitted bid ranges for all resources to simultaneously calculate a high-low feasible schedule. And George went on to describe the details of the framework with submitted bids, which would minimize hourly failures, subject to energy bid limits, ramp rates for forecast, daily energy limits, and state of charge limits. And then he got into some of the simplification regarding which constraints would be considered. A couple of those seemed to be accepted. And then when we got to the last three regarding AS, MSGs, and I guess that was the last one. There were some questions, and so there seemed to be, at the end of the day, a lot of support for this approach with the questions really about, well, which constraints are we going to really consider and try to find a balance between accuracy and then making sure we have something that doesn't take too long to run. And then Mark finished with turning our attention to next week, where we'll talk about the WSPP Schedule C, and then maybe starting to talk about consequences for failure. With that,
thank you, Bob.
Back to you, Mark.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, that is all we had. I'm going to give everyone 8 minutes to think about those formulas George put up for us all to to take a look at and make notes on, and I really appreciate everyone's engagement today. I really do. Hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll hear from you later this week.